My daughter looked me in the eye and told me I was losing my mind. Her husband nodded along like a trained dog. 2 weeks later, they were leaving voicemails at 2 in the morning, crying, begging me to pick up. They'd spent those 2 weeks searching every campground in 3 states. Before we go any further, I want you to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now. I read every single one. The drive back from Lake Cumberland takes about 4 hours, if you don't stop, 3.5 if the highway cooperates. I'd been up there 11 days, longer than I planned, but the crappie were biting well, and I hadn't slept that soundly in years. No one calling my name, no footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom at 10 at night, the muffled arguing, the pointed silence at breakfast. Just the water and the early mornings and coffee I made myself, exactly the way I liked it. I pulled my truck into the driveway on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the leaves on the oak tree out front just beginning to turn. The house looked different before I could say exactly why. It took me a moment standing there with my hand on the door handle before I understood. The flower pots on the porch, the ones Carol had painted herself the summer before she got sick, the ones with the blue morning glories, were gone. Just gone. The porch looked naked without them. I climbed out slowly. My knees had started complaining about long drives sometime around my 62nd birthday, and they hadn't stopped since. I walked to the front door, reached for my keys, and tried the lock. It didn't turn. I pulled the key out, examined it, tried again. Nothing. The lock mechanism didn't even engage properly, the way a wrong key feels in a familiar lock. This was my key. This was my house. I had lived here for 22 years. Someone had changed the lock. I stood on my own porch in the afternoon sun, trying to make that fact mean something other than what it obviously meant. Maybe a locksmith had come by for routine maintenance. Maybe Derek had decided the old lock needed replacing and hadn't thought to tell me. Maybe there had been some kind of emergency and they'd needed a locksmith and had simply forgotten, in all the confusion, to leave me a new key. I was already making excuses for them before I'd knocked on the door. I knocked twice, then a third time. Footsteps inside, unhurried. The door opened and my daughter Rachel stood there in the kind of clothes she wore when she wasn't expecting company. She looked at me the way you look at someone who shows up slightly earlier than expected. "You're back," she said. "I live here," I said. She stepped aside and let me in without quite saying anything else. The house smelled different. Some candle or air freshener that wasn't mine. Something artificial and sweet. The living room had been rearranged. Carol's rocking chair, the one she'd sat in every evening for the last 6 years of her life, the one I'd been very clear about no one moving, was gone from its spot by the window. I asked Rachel where the rocking chair was. She said they'd moved it to the storage unit out back because it was taking up space. I asked about the flower pots on the porch. She said they were cluttering up the entrance. I asked about my lock. She said Derek would explain when he got home. Derek got home at 6:15. He was a tall man, my son-in-law, with the particular kind of confidence that comes from being the tallest person in most rooms and having never been seriously tested. He sold commercial insurance and was good at it, which had given him the impression that persuading people was the same thing as being right. He came in through the garage door, set his laptop bag on the kitchen counter that Carol and I had installed together in 2009, and looked at me across the kitchen island with an expression that was almost, but not quite, apologetic. "Walter," he said, "you're back early." 4 days late, actually, I said. "The lock's been changed." He nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something he'd been expecting. "We need to talk about that." He pulled out one of the bar stools and sat down, which positioned him slightly lower than me, though I doubted he'd thought about that. "Rachel and I have been concerned. About you." I asked him what exactly they were concerned about. He listed things. I'd left the stove on twice in the past month. I sometimes repeated myself in conversation. I'd missed a doctor's appointment in August and hadn't seemed to remember making it. Each item was delivered with careful patience, the tone of someone presenting evidence rather than having a conversation. I said that leaving a stove on twice in 30 days wasn't a medical emergency. I said that everyone repeated themselves occasionally. I said the August appointment had been rescheduled by the doctor's office, not missed. Derek spread his hands in a gesture that was meant to look reasonable. "We're not accusing you of anything. We're just saying that maybe it's time to think about what kind of arrangements make sense going forward, for everyone's safety." Rachel was standing at the edge of the kitchen, not quite in the room, her arms folded across her chest, the way she used to stand when she was 12 years old and knew she was doing something she shouldn't. "What arrangements?" I said. Derek said that they'd been looking at some assisted living communities, that there was a very nice one about 40 minutes north that had a fishing pond on the property, that they wanted me to be somewhere I'd be looked after properly, that the house, given its size and the maintenance involved, was really more than one person needed. I looked at my daughter. She looked at the kitchen floor. "And the lock," I said. Derek said they'd had it rekeyed for security purposes while I was away. He said he could have a new key made for me, for when I visited. There it was, when I visited my own house. I want to be honest about what happened in my chest when he said that. It wasn't quite rage, though rage came later. It was more like a physical sensation of something dropping. 22 years in this house. Carol and I had bought it when Rachel was 7 years old, had carried her on our shoulders through these rooms, had painted every wall ourselves, had argued about backsplash, tile, and cabinet hardware, and the color of the shutters. Carol had died in the master bedroom 3 years ago, in the bed we'd shared for 31 years, and I had stayed in this house because leaving it felt like leaving her, and Derek was sitting in my kitchen explaining that I would need to call ahead before visiting. "I see," I said. Then I picked up my truck keys from where I'd set them on the counter, walked back through the front door, and sat in my truck in the driveway for a few minutes looking at the house. The oak tree Carol had planted from a sapling was 30 feet tall now. The garden beds along the south wall, the ones I'd been maintaining since she couldn't anymore, still had her heirloom roses in them, the ones she'd brought from her mother's yard in Knoxville as cuttings wrapped in wet newspaper. The house was every decision we'd made together for 2.5 decades. I backed out of the driveway and drove to a diner 3 miles away and ordered coffee and eggs I didn't eat, and sat there until the dinner crowd thinned out. I want you to understand how Derek and Rachel had ended up in my house, because the how matters. 2 years earlier, their apartment building in East Nashville had gone through a sale. The new owners had decided to convert to short-term rentals, and they'd had 60 days to find a new place. The rental market was brutal that year, the kind of brutal where a 2-bedroom in a decent neighborhood cost more per month than my entire mortgage had been in 2002. Rachel had called me crying, not asking exactly, but clearly hoping. I told them they could stay in the guest room for a few months while they found something. That had been 23 months ago. I had never asked them for rent, not because I couldn't have used it, but because Rachel was my daughter, and I genuinely enjoyed having some company in the house after Carol passed. Derek had seemed grateful at first. He'd mowed the lawn without being asked. He'd helped me replace the water heater last winter, the two of us working in the cold garage with our breath fogging. I'd thought we were getting along, but something had shifted. I noticed it gradually, the way you notice a change in the weather, not any single moment, but an accumulating pressure. Derek started making decisions about the house without consulting me. He'd had the cable package changed. He'd replaced the porch light fixture. Small things, but consistent. He started referring to the house as our place when talking to friends, a phrase I heard him use twice on phone calls he didn't realize I could hear. And in the last few months, he'd started a campaign of concern about my mental fitness that was gentle enough to seem caring and persistent enough to be a pattern. I turned all of this over in my mind at the diner. Then I drove to a motel off the highway, paid for 2 nights in cash, and went to sleep before 9 o'clock. The next morning I woke up before 6 and lay in the dark, listening to highway traffic and thinking clearly for the first time in weeks. The problem was simple when I stripped away the emotion. My daughter and son-in-law had decided they wanted my house. They were building a case, carefully and methodically, that I was too diminished to live independently. The lock change was both practical and symbolic, a test to see how I'd respond. If I had accepted the new key and the new vocabulary of visiting my own home, the next step would have been a conversation about power of attorney, then a referral to a doctor Derek had already chosen, then documents appearing for me to sign. I am 64 years old. I ran a general contracting business for 31 years. I pulled permits, managed subcontractors, read blueprints, negotiated contracts. I balanced my books by hand until 2015 because I didn't entirely trust software. Whatever Derek and Rachel believed about the stove and the repeated conversations, I knew exactly what I owned and who owned it. I called an attorney at 8 in the morning, His name was James Whitfield, estate and property law, and a friend of a friend had used him to contest a boundary dispute 3 years ago and spoken highly of him. His assistant told me he had a 9:15 opening. I arrived 10 minutes early with a manila folder I'd kept in the lockbox in my truck, the one I maintain for documents I consider important: the house deed, the property tax history, my homeowner's insurance policy, the original purchase agreement from 2002 with Carol's and my signatures on every page. Whitfield was a compact man in his mid-50s with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on. He went through my documents the way a careful reader goes through a book, page by page, not rushing. "The property is in your name alone," he said, after several minutes. "Your wife's name was removed from the deed when she passed, which is standard procedure. There's no co-ownership, no lien, no encumbrance of any kind. You own this property free and clear." I told him about the lock change, about the assisted living conversation, about 23 months of my daughter and son-in-law living in my house without a lease, without rent, without any legal documentation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he set his reading glasses on the desk. "They have no legal claim to the property," he said. "They're occupants without a lease, which in Tennessee creates a month-to-month tenancy by default. You can terminate that tenancy with 30 days written notice. Alternatively, since the lock change constitutes an attempt to restrict your access to your own property, you may have grounds to pursue it more aggressively. A court could order immediate vacating." I asked what would happen if I decided to sell. He said that as the sole owner, I had every legal right to list the property, accept an offer, and close the sale. The occupants would receive formal notice through the standard process and would be required to vacate before closing. The warmth that moved through me in that office was different from anger. Anger had been burning in my chest since the night before. This was something steadier. 40 years of careful living, of paying what I owed and keeping records, and never signing anything I hadn't read, had brought me to a room where a stranger with reading glasses was confirming what I'd always known but had almost been talked out of believing. I was not a confused old man who needed looking after. I was a property owner who'd been living with squatters. I thanked Whitfield, paid his consultation fee, and walked back to my truck in the morning sunlight. My next call was to a realtor named Donna Hartley, who a colleague had used to sell a duplex last spring and described as someone who didn't waste words or time. She picked up on the second ring. I told her I had a 4-bedroom craftsman on a third of an acre in a neighborhood that had been appreciating steadily for 6 years. I told her I needed it listed as quickly as possible and that I expected professional photography and serious buyers only. She said she could have a photographer out Friday and the listing active by Monday. I told her that would be fine and that the current occupants might not be cooperative during showings, but that as the legal owner, I was authorizing all access. There was a brief pause. "Understood," she said. "We'll coordinate everything through you." By noon, I had signed listing documents at Donna's office and was back in my truck with the windows down and nowhere I needed to be. The freedom of that was something I hadn't felt in years, maybe since before Carol got sick. No schedule built around someone else's preferences. No careful navigation of moods that weren't mine. Just an open afternoon in a city I'd lived in long enough to know every worthwhile road. I drove to a sporting goods store and bought supplies. Then I drove home, where I still had my truck and my tools, and the keys to my fifth-wheel trailer stored in the back lot of my contractor buddy Pete's property. I'd bought the trailer 4 years ago when I'd had vague plans about retirement travel that had never quite materialized. It had been sitting under a tarp at Pete's for 8 months. I called Pete and told him I needed the trailer. He said come get it whenever and didn't ask questions, which is what I've always valued about Pete. I hitched the trailer that evening without going back inside the house. My tools were in the truck, my documents were in the lockbox, my medications were in the bag I'd brought to the lake. There wasn't much else I needed immediately. The things that mattered, the photographs, Carol's jewelry, the Christmas ornaments we'd collected every year of our marriage, were inside, but they could wait until Rachel and Derek were served their notice, and I had access to my own property through proper legal channels. I drove the trailer to a campground outside of town that I'd used before and paid for a week's stay. The site had water and electric hookup, good shade, and a view of a pond that wasn't bad in the evening light. I set up in under an hour, made a pot of real coffee on the trailer's propane stove, and sat outside in a folding chair, watching the sky go dark. Then I turned off my phone. Not silenced it, turned it completely off, and put it in the drawer under the trailer's kitchen bench, which I then closed. I want to tell you what the next 10 days felt like because I think it's important. People assume that when you take yourself out of a situation you've been suffering through, there's immediate relief. And there is relief. Eventually. But the first couple of days were hard in ways I hadn't expected. You don't spend 2 years adjusting yourself to other people's needs and then simply stop. I woke up at 3 the first night with my heart pounding, convinced I'd forgotten something urgent. I sat up in the dark trailer and made myself name the things I actually controlled. I own the house. The listing is active. The attorney has my documents. I am not lost. By the third day, something had loosened. I drove to a fishing spot I'd known since the 90s and caught enough bass to justify a proper fish fry. I called Pete from a payphone, one of the last ones still operational in the county, and he confirmed that a realtor had contacted him as one of my character references. He said he told her I was the most organized man he'd ever worked with, and that the property was worth every penny of the asking price. By the end of the first week, I had driven down to the Natchez Trace Parkway, a road I had always meant to spend more time on, and I was camped in Mississippi with the windows open, listening to night sounds that had nothing to do with Nashville. On day 10, I turned my phone back on. It took 4 minutes for the notifications to finish loading. 83 missed calls, 61 voicemails, text messages running off the bottom of the screen. The numbers were still climbing as new calls came in while I stood there reading them. Rachel's voicemails began confused and escalated quickly. The first ones, from the day after I'd left, were carefully controlled. Dad, I don't know what you're doing, but we should talk. Dad, Donna Hartley came by with a photographer, and we need to discuss this. Then, as the week progressed, the control dissolved. Dad, people have been walking through the house. Derek talked to an attorney and he says you can do this, but please just call me. Dad, we've been calling everyone. Pete won't tell us where you are. Dad, please. Derek's messages were a study in a man discovering that the levers he expected to work were attached to nothing. The early ones were brisk and managerial. Walter, this is an overreaction to a misunderstanding. Call me and we can resolve this like adults. Then, later, Walter, I want you to know that I understand why you're upset, and I take responsibility for how the conversation went. Then, in a voicemail from 3 nights ago, his voice stripped of everything except exhaustion. Walter, we don't know where you are. We've called your doctor, your friends, Rachel's aunt in Knoxville. Nobody knows anything. We're scared. I'm asking you, man to man, please just let us know you're safe. I sat on the trailer steps in Mississippi reading through the messages for a long time. There was a part of me that felt something complicated about Rachel's voice in those later voicemails. She was still my daughter. I had taught her to drive in an empty parking lot on a Sunday morning. I had sat with her in a hospital waiting room for 9 hours when her appendix came out at 19 and she'd been terrified. Those things didn't disappear. But I also remembered her standing at the edge of the kitchen while her husband told me I would need to call ahead to visit my own home. I remembered her not saying a word. I called Donna. She said interest had been strong and that she had 2 offers in hand, both within 3% of asking price, both from buyers who could move quickly. One was a couple in their late 30s relocating from Chicago, both of them doctors at Vanderbilt, looking to put down roots. I told her to proceed with the stronger offer and let the process run. Then I called Whitfield's office and had his assistant confirm that the 30-day notice paperwork had been delivered, which it had, by certified mail, with signature confirmation. Then I put the phone in my pocket, unhitched the trailer, and started driving north. Not because they deserved a faster resolution, because I had resolved to do what needed doing, and avoiding it past that point would have been its own kind of smallness. I pulled back into Nashville on a Thursday evening. The campground outside town was where I'd started, and I returned to the same site out of something like habit. I showered, changed clothes, made dinner, and slept better than I had in 2 years. Friday morning I drove to the house. Not my truck with the trailer, just the truck, clean and straightforward. I parked at the curb. Rachel came out before I reached the front door. She looked like someone who had stopped sleeping properly. Her hair not entirely pulled together. Lines around her eyes that I could attribute to age, but knew were something more recent. She crossed the porch quickly, and I could see she was trying to decide between anger and relief, and that relief was winning. Dad. Her voice broke a little on the single syllable. Rachel, I said. Derek appeared in the doorway behind her. 2 weeks had taken something out of him, too. The particular certainty that had always lived in his posture was diminished, replaced by something uncertain and smaller. Walter, he said, we've been trying to reach you. I know, I told him. Rachel said they needed to talk. She said that obviously things had gone too far. She said that the assisted living conversation had been poorly handled and that she was sorry and that she wanted to sit down together and figure something out. I asked what kind of something she had in mind. She said maybe they could look at a rental agreement, something formal, with real terms. She said Derek had a good income and they could pay fair market rent, and maybe this could actually work out in a way that was good for everyone. Derek was nodding behind her with the careful enthusiasm of someone who has done the math and is hoping you haven't. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. The oak tree Carol had planted was behind her, its leaves mostly turned now, that particular gold that only lasts a week or two before it all comes down. I had a photograph of Carol standing in front of that tree the October before her diagnosis, laughing at something off camera, and I knew what the tree would look like in that photo, and I knew what it looked like now, taller and wider and completely indifferent to everything that had happened under it. You knew the house was mine, I said. You knew for 23 months that you were living in my house with my permission. And when you decided that permission was inconvenient, you didn't renegotiate. You changed the locks and started building a case about my mental fitness. Rachel started to speak. I raised my hand, not aggressively, just clearly. The house closes in 16 days. The buyers are a couple your age from Chicago. I think they'll take good care of it. I paused. Carol's rocking chair is in the storage unit out back. I'll be stopping by this week to retrieve it and a few other things, and I'd appreciate it if you had them accessible. Derek said my name. His voice had lost its selling tone entirely. I said that the 30-day notice had been delivered and that they would receive formal vacating instructions from Whitfield's office before end of week. Rachel said, quietly, that this was her childhood home. I told her that I knew that. I told her that was exactly why I had kept it for 22 years and maintained it, and paid the taxes and replaced the roof in 2019, and repaired the foundation drainage, and replanted her mother's roses after a hard winter killed them back to the root. I told her that loving a home and taking it for granted were different things, and that I had spent 2 years watching her learn that distinction from the wrong direction. She was crying by then, not manipulatively, just genuinely. The way people cry when they've finally understood something they can't undo. I told her I loved her. I told her that fact was not in dispute, and never would be, but that it also didn't change the practical reality of the situation she and Derek had created. I told her I hoped they would find a place they could build something that actually belonged to them, which was a different feeling than living in someone else's generosity and pretending it was the same thing. Then I got back in my truck. I didn't feel the triumph I might have expected. Mostly I felt tired in the way you feel tired at the end of a long job well done, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from having done something correctly and completely. 3 weeks after that, I signed the closing documents at a title company on a Tuesday morning. The buyers, Nathan and Elise, were there in person, which not all buyers are. Elise had a folder with paint color samples in it. Nathan asked me 3 questions about the rose bushes along the south wall, whether they were difficult to maintain, what variety they were, how old they'd been there. I told him they were David Austin climbing roses that my wife had brought from her mother's yard in Knoxville as cuttings in 2003. I told him they needed cutting back in late February and a layer of mulch after the first hard frost. He wrote it down in a small notebook. "We'll take care of them," he said. I believed him. The check was substantial. 31 years of contracting work, a paid-off house, and a neighborhood that had appreciated quietly for 2 decades had combined into a number I could now do something with. I deposited it that afternoon and sat in the bank parking lot for a while just thinking about Carol, who had been practical enough to understand that a house was an investment and sentimental enough to paint flower pots for the porch. She would have had thoughts about all of this. Sharp ones. I found a piece of land 40 miles east of Nashville, 6 acres backing up to a creek, with a view of the ridge that changed color all through the fall. I hired a builder I knew from my contracting days, Someone who understood what I wanted and didn't need to be managed like a child. The design was simple. One story, everything on the ground floor, wide porch running the full south side, where I could sit in Carol's rocking chair and watch the light change over the ridge through all 4 seasons. Rachel called me in November, on a Sunday evening. She said they'd found an apartment in East Nashville, a real one with a real lease in their real names, and that it was actually nice. She said Derek had been quiet for a while and she thought that was probably healthy. She asked if they could come see the land sometime. I told her yes, once the house was finished. I told her she could bring Derek if she wanted. She asked if I was okay. The question was genuine, stripped of the earlier careful management of it. I told her I was better than I'd been in 2 years. I told her that was true and that I wasn't saying it to make a point. There was quiet on the phone for a moment, the comfortable kind. Mom would have handled all of this better than either of us, she said. I told her that Carol had always had an unfair advantage in that department and that some of us just had to do the best we could. She laughed a little, and it sounded like her from before the apartment and the arrangements and the lock on the wrong door. The build finished in March. I moved in on a Wednesday, pulling up the driveway with Carol's rocking chair strapped in the truck bed wrapped in moving blankets. I set it on the south porch as the first piece of furniture, which felt right. First things first. The creek sounds different at night than I expected, louder and more varied, and I lie awake sometimes just listening to it. It sounds like something moving forward without being in any particular hurry, which is about the right pace for a man who has learned that patience is not the same thing as being passive, and that walking away from something that isn't yours to lose is the first step toward finding what actually is. If this story meant something to you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments below. And to hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for listening.